Hey guys. Tonight we step into a wind so sharp it feels like it's personally offended by your existence. You're standing on the edge of a raw colonial settlement, somewhere along the New England coast. And the air smells like wet timber, wood smoke, and distant salt. Autumn is thinning. The trees have already surrendered most of their leaves. And the ground is stiff with early frost. Your boots sink slightly into mud that will soon freeze solid as brick. You look at your half-finished cabin and think, quite reasonably, that you might not survive this. Honestly, you probably wouldn't. I say that with love. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't arrive in spring, when flowers pretend everything will be fine. You arrive in late autumn, when the sky hangs low and gray and the wind carries a warning. The year could be 1620, like the Pilgrims stepping ashore at Plymouth. Or it could be later in the 17th century, when settlements are scattered but still fragile. Either way, winter is coming, and you have weeks, maybe days, to prepare. You stand beside your family, staring at the rough outline of a timber house. It's more suggestion than shelter. Logs notched imperfectly, gaps between boards that let the wind whistle through like it's checking on you. There's no insulation beyond mud, straw, and hope, mostly hope. One of the most famous examples of what happens when winter preparation fails is Jamestown's starving time in 1609 to 1610. When shortages and brutal cold led to catastrophic mortality. You've heard whispers of it, of hunger so severe that survival became desperate beyond imagination. The lesson is simple. Winter does not negotiate. You pick up an axe. The sound of wood splitting echoes through the clearing. Every swing feels urgent. You need walls sealed, a roof secured, firewood stacked, food stored. There is no grocery store, no delivery service, no thermostat you can gently adjust while wearing fuzzy socks. You are the thermostat. A lesser-known fact about early colonial homes. Many were initially built with packed earth floors, not wooden planks, which means your living room is essentially cold dirt. Very rustic, very immersive, not recommended for bare feet in January. You kneel to pack mud into the cracks between logs. Your fingers sting from cold. The mud will freeze soon, sealing the gaps temporarily. It's crude insulation, but it works. Sort of. Colonial families often used wattle and daub, woven branches plastered with clay, to block drafts. It wasn't pretty, but it kept wind from casually rearranging your internal organs. Your children gather kindling nearby. Even the youngest understands urgency. In settlements like Plymouth, the first winter claimed nearly half the colonists. Exposure, disease, malnutrition, they combined into a silent arithmetic that winter performs without emotion. Historians still debate the precise balance of causes behind those early high mortality rates. How much was disease brought from Europe? How much was malnutrition? How much was environmental shock? But they agree on one thing. Unpreparedness magnified everything. You glance at the forest. It feels endless, dark, promising and threatening at once. You'll need firewood, more than you think. Colonial families often burned between 20 and 40 cords of wood per winter in colder regions. That's not a stack. That's a small mountain. If you think chopping wood for a cozy Instagram moment is romantic, try doing it for 6 months straight. The sun dips earlier each evening now. The light fades quickly, and with it your margin for error. You hurry to thatch part of the roof with reeds and whatever material you can gather. The wind tests it immediately. Inside, the cabin smells of fresh-cut pine and damp earth. You imagine snow piling against the walls, wind clawing at the door. You imagine your family huddled close to a fire that must not go out. Ever. Because that fire will mean heat, light, cooked food, dry clothing, survival. You sit for a moment on a rough-hewn log, breathing in the sharp air. The world feels enormous and indifferent. There are no neighbors within shouting distance. No emergency services. No weather forecast warning you about an incoming blizzard. Only instinct, labor, preparation. Some settlers underestimated how different North American winters could be from those in parts of England or the Netherlands. The climate during the period known as the Little Ice Age meant colder than average winters across parts of the Northern Hemisphere. Rivers froze deeper, snow fell heavier, seasons stretched longer. Historians still argue about how much the Little Ice Age intensified colonial hardship versus how much poor planning did the rest. You suspect the answer is both, and neither will spare you. The wind picks up again. You stand. There is no time to dwell. Every hour without preparation increases risk. You lift another log, pack another seam, stack another armful of wood beside the hearth that doesn't yet exist. The first snow hasn't fallen yet, but you can feel it coming. You don't get to admire the sunset for long. The air grows sharper each evening, and the ground beneath your boots stiffens like it's practicing for permanence. If Section 1 was the warning, this is the work. You rise before dawn because daylight is currency, and winter is about to inflate the cost of everything. The cabin stands half-finished, its logs sweating sap in the cold. You run your hand along the wall and feel the wind slipping through gaps that would be charming in summer and catastrophic in January. So you begin sealing. Colonial families often used clay, moss, straw, and even animal hair to chink the spaces between logs. You press damp clay into the seams with numb fingers, smoothing it flat. It won't win design awards, but it might stop your breath from turning into indoor snow. A lesser-known detail: some early New England homes were built with central chimneys made of stone, designed to radiate heat into multiple rooms. The logic was simple: if you're going to burn half a forest, you might as well distribute the benefits. Of course, building a stone chimney without modern mortar is less HGTV makeover and more back-breaking geometry puzzle. You haul rocks from a nearby stream, stacking them carefully. The hearth becomes the anchor of the house. Without it, the structure is just wood pretending to be shelter. Your spouse needs clay near the doorway, mixing it with straw. The children gather moss to stuff into smaller cracks. Everyone works because everyone must. There's no concept of, I'm not really a morning person. Winter does not care about your personality type. You remember hearing about the first winter at Plymouth in 1620 to 1621, when exposure and illness devastated the settlement. Nearly half the colonists died before spring. Many of the surviving families had arrived too late in the season to build proper shelters or plant crops. You are determined not to repeat that timeline. Historians still debate whether poor initial planning or sheer environmental misfortune played the larger role in that tragic winter. You suspect that when temperatures drop below freezing for weeks, the difference becomes academic. Inside the cabin, you lay down planks over part of the dirt floor. You can't cover all of it, but even a small wooden platform keeps sleeping bodies off frozen ground. Colonists often used straw-filled mattresses or simple pallets. Luxurious, if you enjoy the aesthetic of rustic survival chic. You hang animal hides along interior walls to trap warmth. They smell faintly of smoke and tannin. It's not unpleasant, just honest. Honest like everything here. The door is your next problem. A poorly fitted door is an invitation for wind to waltz in unannounced. You plane the wood as best you can, testing the swing, adjusting the hinges. You stuff fabric scraps along the bottom seam. Draft prevention becomes a form of art. A curious, lesser-known fact: some colonial homes in colder regions built smaller windows intentionally to minimize heat loss. Large windows look grand, but in January they're basically decorative ice sculptures. You cover your small window opening with oiled paper instead of glass. It lets in light while keeping out some wind. It also makes everything look like it's permanently wrapped in parchment. You step back and examine the cabin. It's crude, crooked, imperfect. But it's yours. The first thin layer of frost appears one morning, sparkling across the clearing like a polite reminder. The forest is quieter now. Leaves crunch underfoot. The air smells metallic, like approaching snow. You begin stockpiling more wood. You've already stacked what feels like a heroic amount. But older settlers warn you it's not enough. Colonial families often underestimated fuel needs their first winter. Running out of firewood in February is not a character-building experience. It's a crisis. So you chop, and stack, and cover the pile with branches to keep it dry. You test the hearth fire one evening. Smoke curls upward through the chimney draft. It works, mostly. A bit of smoke lingers, making your eyes water. You adjust stones. Add mud. Try again. Fire becomes your heartbeat. If it dies in the night, you wake cold and vulnerable. So someone will rise periodically to feed it. You don't have an alarm clock, just instinct and shared responsibility. You kneel beside the hearth, warming your hands. The clay between the logs has dried, hardening into something like protection. The hides hang still against the wall. The roof, patched with reeds and bark, holds against the wind for now. Outside, the sky lowers. The first real snow is only days away. You sit close to your family in the dim glow of the fire. There's no electricity, no glowing screens, just flame flicker and breath rising in pale clouds. The cabin is not comfortable. It is survivable. And in a world where winter writes its own rules, survivable is victory enough for tonight. The cabin stands. The hearth breathes. But walls alone do not feed you. You step outside at dawn. Breath already visible in the thin blue air. The frost crunches beneath your boots like brittle glass. The forest is no longer colorful. It's skeletal. Beautiful in a quiet, slightly threatening way. Winter preparation is no longer about timber. It's about food. You inventory what you have. Dried corn. A few sacks of beans. Salted fish hanging stiff in the smokehouse. Strips of venison cured over slow-burning coals. Barrels of apples stored in the coolest corner of the cabin. A small stash of flour that must be rationed carefully. You remember Jamestown again, not because you enjoy historical anxiety, but because it's instructive. During the winter of 1609 to 1610, the so-called starving time, food shortages combined with harsh weather and strained relations led to catastrophic mortality. Archaeological evidence has since confirmed how desperate conditions became. Historians still debate how much of Jamestown's suffering stemmed from poor leadership versus environmental hardship and supply failures. But everyone agrees on one thing: without adequate stores, winter is unforgiving. You examine your stores with the eyes of someone calculating survival, not menu variety. Colonial winter diets were repetitive by necessity. Fresh produce disappears. Meat must be preserved. Salt becomes a precious ally. A lesser-known fact: colonists often relied heavily on dried peas and beans in winter, which provided essential protein and could be stored for months. Imagine a menu that reads, peas, peas again, surprise, more peas. Culinary excitement was not the goal. Staying alive was. You begin reinforcing your food storage. Barrels are checked for leaks. Grain is moved off the dirt floor to prevent moisture damage. Mice are your silent competitors now. You set simple traps, knowing that one careless breach can cost you weeks of sustenance. The children help string onions and garlic from rafters. The cabin smells sharp and earthy. You hang herbs near the hearth, sage, thyme, both for flavor and modest medicinal hope. In Plymouth's early years, colonists learned to cultivate and store maize more effectively, partly through knowledge shared by indigenous peoples like Squanto, who taught techniques for planting and preservation. Without that assistance, survival odds would have been even lower. Historians still debate the full scope of indigenous contributions to colonial winter survival. How much was documented versus undercredited? You suspect the assistance was larger than many early accounts admitted. You test a piece of salted pork, rehydrating it slowly in simmering water. The smell is strong, almost overwhelming. Salt was essential to preservation, but it doesn't exactly whisper subtle flavor notes. You chew thoughtfully. It's tough, but nourishing. Colonial families often slaughtered livestock in late autumn, preserving as much meat as possible before deep freeze made butchering impractical. You recall helping with that grim task weeks ago, smoke stinging your eyes as you cured strips of meat above a low fire. It wasn't pleasant. It was necessary. You measure your stores mentally against the length of winter you expect. The Little Ice Age means colder seasons and sometimes longer ones. Rivers freeze earlier, thaws arrive later. A lesser-known reality: some New England winters in the 17th century were severe enough to freeze coastal harbors partially, disrupting supply ships. If you were counting on resupply, winter sometimes politely declined your optimism. You begin ration planning. It feels clinical. You calculate how much cornmeal per day, how often meat can be used without depleting reserves too quickly. Your spouse suggests stretching stews with more water. You nod. Water is abundant, until it freezes. But that problem belongs to another section of your life. For now, liquid still flows. You test drying additional apple slices near the hearth. The warmth helps remove moisture. The smell is faintly sweet, a small mercy in a season that offers few. There's a rhythm to preservation work. Slice, hang, stir, salt, seal. You pause to listen. The wind brushes the cabin walls lightly, as if assessing your efforts. You think about those early settlers who underestimated the scale of what winter demanded. Optimism does not insulate. Faith does not salt pork. Hard labor does. You step outside again to check your small root cellar, a shallow pit reinforced with planks and covered with earth. Inside, turnips and carrots rest in cool darkness. Root cellars were simple but effective technology, using Earth's stable temperature to slow spoilage. A lesser-known detail, some colonists layered vegetables in sand within cellars to extend freshness. It's not glamorous, but neither is January. You cover the cellar carefully. Snow will soon add another insulating layer. Snow, surprisingly, can protect crops beneath it by stabilizing temperature. A reminder that even the harshest elements sometimes offer quiet assistance. You return to the cabin, hands stiff but purposeful. The shelves look fuller now. Barrels sealed, meat hanging, grain protected. You know it may still not be enough. But tonight, as the first true snow begins to fall, soft, deliberate flakes drifting from a heavy sky, you feel something close to preparedness. Not comfort, but readiness. The snow doesn't fall gently for long. It gathers confidence. What begins as delicate flakes turns into steady accumulation, layering the clearing in white silence. You step outside early, boots sinking deeper than yesterday. The world is muffled now. The forest stands hushed, branches sagging under fresh weight. And you look at your woodpile. Because winter, in its most practical form, is measured in stacks. Colonial families in colder regions often burned staggering amounts of firewood, sometimes 20 or more cords in a single season. A cord is not a cozy little bundle. It's a tightly stacked pile 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, 8 feet long. Multiply that by 20 and you begin to understand that your axe is not a hobby. It is survival equipment. You lift it again. The sound of splitting wood cuts sharply through the frozen air. Each strike echoes like punctuation. Chop, stack, repeat. You remember hearing that early settlers frequently underestimated fuel needs their first winter. Some even dismantled fences or outbuildings for emergency firewood by February. Historians still debate whether this underestimation was due to unfamiliar climate conditions or simply exhaustion from the endless labor required before winter even began. Probably both. Winter has a way of exploiting miscalculations. You stack the wood carefully against the cabin wall, raising it off the ground on small logs to prevent moisture seepage. Snow can insulate, yes, but wet wood is useless wood. And useless wood is cold fingers and colder nights. A lesser-known fact, colonial families sometimes burned green wood in desperation, which produced heavy smoke and poor heat output. It also turned your cabin into something resembling a medieval sauna, without the spa benefits. Inside, the hearth crackles steadily. You kneel to adjust the logs, careful not to smother the flame. Maintaining fire is an art. Too little air and it dies. Too much and it devours your carefully rationed supply. You begin to understand that heat is currency. Every log represents hours of warmth. Every careless blaze costs you future comfort. Your children carry smaller sticks inside, stacking kindling in neat bundles. Even they recognize the ritual now. Fire in the morning, fire at midday, fire before sleep, fire during the night watch. You assign turns for tending the hearth. Someone must rise if the flames weaken. Colonial families often slept lightly in winter. Not because of anxiety alone but because the hearth demanded vigilance. Fire was warmth, but also danger. Chimney fires were a real risk in homes lined with creosote from smoky fuel. Historians still debate how common devastating winter house fires were compared to deaths from exposure. But both dangers lingered in the same room. Too little fire, you freeze. Too much, you burn. Balance becomes everything. Outside, the snow thickens. You glance at the tree line and imagine how much farther you'll need to travel as nearby wood becomes scarce. Colonial settlements often cleared forests quickly around cabins, forcing longer treks for fresh timber each year. Distance adds fatigue. Fatigue invites mistakes. A lesser-known winter reality, sledges were sometimes used to haul heavy logs across snow, turning frozen ground into a temporary highway. You consider building one if the snow deepens enough. Innovation often follows necessity. You test the door seal again. Wind slips through faintly, but less than before. The oiled paper window glows softly in pale daylight. Inside, the temperature hovers just above tolerable, which, in colonial winter terms, is practically tropical. You sit briefly by the hearth, rubbing your hands together. The smell of burning oak fills the cabin, sharp, comforting. Outside, the world grows white and distant. You think about how many early colonial families survived purely because they respected firewood more than comfort. The act of stacking logs in autumn determined whether children slept warm in January. You glance at your pile again. It looks large. It also looks insufficient. Winter has just begun. The forest will not complain when you cut it, but it will not replenish quickly either. You stand once more, lift the axe, and walk back into the snow. The flakes settle on your shoulders, melt briefly, then freeze at the edges of your collar. Chop, stack, repeat. Heat is not guaranteed. It is earned, one swing at a time. You learn quickly that warmth isn't just about fire. It's about layers. The snow now rests knee-deep outside the cabin, and the air inside, despite your heroic woodpile, hovers somewhere between brisk and character building. You wrap yourself in wool and try not to think about modern thermostats. If you had one, you'd probably set it to 72 degrees and complain about drafts. Here, 40 degrees feels like luxury. Colonial clothing was practical, layered, and, let's be honest, not exactly runway ready. You start with a linen shift or shirt close to the skin. Then add wool garments over it. Wool is your closest friend this season. It insulates even when damp and traps warmth surprisingly well. Scratchy, yes. Effective, also yes. Fashionable, debatable. A lesser-known fact, many colonists wore multiple petticoats or waistcoats during winter. Layering fabric not just for warmth but as a substitute for what we'd now call insulation. Think of it as wearing your entire closet at once, but with fewer color options. Mostly brown, maybe gray. You wrap a woolen cap over your head. Heat escapes quickly there, even indoors. Many colonists kept head coverings on during winter nights. It wasn't dramatic, it was practical. You glance at your children, bundled like small fabric onions. Layers overlapping at wrists and ankles. You tuck extra scraps around their feet. Wool stockings are precious. If one tears, it's mended immediately. Colonial families wasted nothing. Worn garments were patched repeatedly, cut down to fit younger children, then repurposed as rags. Some settlers even unraveled old knitted items to reuse the yarn. Sustainability wasn't trendy, it was mandatory. Historians still debate how much European colonists had to adapt their clothing practices to New World winters versus how much they already understood from colder regions in Europe. What's clear is that initial optimism about manageable winters often faded after the first true blizzard. You remember hearing about early Massachusetts Bay settlers who arrived expecting a climate similar to England's. They quickly learned that New England could deliver colder, harsher stretches of winter. The Little Ice Age amplified those conditions, making even seasoned Europeans question their layering strategy. You pull on fur-lined mittens, grateful for small luxuries. Animal pelts, when properly cured, provide remarkable insulation. Indigenous communities had long perfected winter clothing suited for these climates, using fur and layered hides effectively. Colonists often adopted these methods, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly. A lesser-known detail: some settlers greased leather boots with animal fat to improve water resistance. It worked reasonably well, though it left you smelling faintly like a cooking experiment. Still better than frostbite. You test your boots at the threshold. The snow squeaks underfoot, a sound that only appears in very cold temperatures. It's oddly satisfying, like stepping on crisp sugar. Your breath rises in clouds as you cross the clearing to check the woodpile. Even fully clothed, the cold presses against you like a physical presence. You understand now why people huddle close to the hearth indoors. Inside, you hang damp mittens near the fire to dry. But not too close. Too close and they scorch. Too far and they remain damp. Colonial winter is a continuous calibration exercise. At night, you sleep in layers as well. Linen shift, wool blanket, possibly two. Families often shared beds for warmth, not purely for sentiment, but for survival. Body heat becomes a shared resource. Privacy takes a winter vacation. Historians still argue about how much communal sleeping arrangements reduced illness versus increased the spread of disease in cramped colonial homes. Warmth is protective, but proximity has its own risks. You lie down beside the fire's fading glow, careful to bank the embers properly before sleep. Banking means covering hot coals with ash to preserve heat until morning. It's like setting your fire to sleep mode, except it can't update itself overnight. The cabin creaks softly as wind moves against the logs. The roof holds. The clay seams remain intact. You tuck the blankets closer. The wool scratches faintly at your chin, but it's a reassuring scratch. It means insulation. Outside, the snow continues falling, erasing tracks, softening the landscape. Inside, layers of fabric, of firelight, of breath, create a fragile warmth. It's not comfort in the modern sense. It's not cozy in the Instagram sense. But it is enough to keep you from freezing tonight. And tonight, that is victory. The blizzard arrives without asking your opinion. You wake before dawn to a sound that feels heavier than snowfall. The wind howls, not politely, not playfully, but with purpose. It presses against the cabin walls as if testing your craftsmanship from Section 2. You sit up slowly, listening. The hearth still glows faintly. Good, that's one problem managed. You rise and step toward the door. It resists when you push it open. Snow has drifted halfway up the frame overnight. The world outside is no longer a clearing, it's a white wall. You close the door quickly, brushing snow from your sleeves. This is not the gentle first snow from Section 3. This is the kind of storm that made early New England winters infamous. Historical accounts describe brutal blizzards in 17th-century Massachusetts where snowdrifts buried fences and blocked cabin doors. Some settlers reported being confined indoors for days. Travel became impossible. Livestock had to be dug out. Historians still debate whether colonial descriptions exaggerated the frequency of such storms or whether the Little Ice Age genuinely produced harsher winter extremes than later centuries. But standing here, hearing wind shake your cabin, the debate feels distant. The storm is real enough. You check the roof for leaks. So far, it holds. The thatch and bark layering you installed in autumn prove their worth. Snow piles along the eaves, creating natural insulation. Ironically, the same snow threatening to bury you also helps trap heat inside. Winter is complicated like that. Inside, the cabin grows dimmer. Snow clings to the oiled paper window, muting daylight. You light an extra tallow candle. The flame flickers, casting soft shadows along the log walls. A lesser-known fact, tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, were common in colonial homes. They burned unevenly and sometimes smelled faintly like dinner gone wrong, but they provided essential light during the long winter darkness. You gather your family closer to the hearth. Firewood must be rationed carefully during a storm. You don't know how long this will last. You feed the flames steadily but not extravagantly. Outside, the wind roars again. The cabin shudders slightly. You remember accounts of early settlers who underestimated wind chill. A thermometer reading might not look catastrophic, but combined with high wind, exposed skin could freeze quickly. Frostbite was not uncommon during severe cold snaps. You wrap scarves more tightly around the children's faces before allowing anyone near the door. Even stepping outside briefly to clear snow carries risk. But you must clear it. You open the door just enough to push snow away from the threshold. The wind bites instantly at your cheeks. Snow stings like fine needles. You shovel methodically, careful not to exhaust yourself. Colonial survival often hinged on energy conservation. Overexertion in freezing weather can be dangerous. A lesser-known winter detail, settlers sometimes marked paths between cabin and barn with poles or rope during blizzards to avoid becoming disoriented in whiteout conditions. You consider doing the same once the wind eases. Losing your way 20 feet from your own door would be a humiliating footnote in history. Back inside, you stomp snow from your boots and rejoin the hearth. The storm continues for hours. Time stretches. The cabin feels smaller, tighter. The fire becomes your son. You cook a thin stew, beans stretched with salted pork. Steam rises into the cold air above the hearth. The smell is comforting, if repetitive. Your diet is becoming predictable enough to qualify as a personality trait. You tell quiet stories to pass the time. Colonial families often relied on storytelling, reading from the Bible, or simple handcrafts to endure long storms. There were no distractions beyond human company and flame. Historians still debate how much winter isolation strengthened family bonds versus frayed them. Cabin fever is not a modern invention. Weeks indoors can test even the calmest spirits. The wind finally begins to weaken near evening. The silence that follows feels almost sacred. You open the door cautiously. The clearing has transformed. Snowdrifts tower waist-high in places. The forest looks sculpted, frozen in soft curves. It's beautiful. It's also isolating. Travel is impossible until paths are cleared. Trade is paused. You are a small island of warmth in a vast white ocean. You close the door again and bank the fire for the night. The blizzard has tested your walls. They held. Your preparations from earlier sections, chinking the logs, stacking the wood, layering the roof, have proven their worth. Winter is no longer theoretical. It has arrived in full force. And you are still here. The storm passes. But winter doesn't apologize. It simply settles in. You wake to a brittle quiet. Snow blankets everything outside, soft and deceptively peaceful. Inside, however, the air feels heavy. The cabin has been sealed tight against wind, which means warmth lingers, but so does everything else. Smoke, breath, dampness, and illness. Colonial winters were not just battles against cold. They were battles against invisible threats thriving in cramped quarters. You sit by the hearth, listening to your youngest cough faintly in the corner. It's not severe, just persistent. Still, in a 17th century settlement, even a mild cough can trigger unease. Respiratory illnesses were common in winter months. Influenza, pneumonia, and various fevers spread more easily when families lived in close quarters with limited ventilation. Historians still debate the exact mortality rates from winter illnesses in early colonies because records were inconsistent. But it's widely understood that disease compounded the dangers of exposure and malnutrition. Cold weakens the body. Malnutrition weakens it further. Illness then finds its opening. You check the child's forehead gently. Warm, but not alarmingly so. You offer warm broth and wrap another blanket around small shoulders. Wool scratches, but it protects. A lesser-known detail: colonial families often relied on simple herbal remedies during winter, willow bark for pain relief, horehound for coughs, elderberry for fever. These remedies varied in effectiveness, but they represented knowledge passed down through generations. Sometimes from Europe, sometimes learned from indigenous neighbors. You hang a small bundle of dried herbs near the fire to release their scent. The cabin fills with a faint, earthy aroma. It feels comforting, even if its medicinal power is modest. Ventilation becomes a delicate dance. Too much fresh air invites freezing drafts. Too little and smoke and sickness linger. You crack the door briefly during midday, allowing a flush of cold air to sweep through. Everyone protests. You insist. Short-term discomfort may prevent longer-term trouble. You remember reading about how smallpox devastated indigenous populations earlier in the century, carried unintentionally by European settlers. Disease moved through winter communities with terrifying speed. While your current worry is more modest, the memory lingers in the broader story of colonial survival. Historians still argue about how environmental stress during winter influenced disease severity and mortality rates. Malnourished bodies struggle to fight infection. Harsh climates magnify small weaknesses. You feel the dryness in your own throat. The hearth dries the air inside the cabin. Your skin cracks at the knuckles. Lips chap. Even comfort has side effects. A lesser-known winter nuisance: Lice and other pests often became more noticeable in cold months because heavy clothing and limited washing created ideal conditions. Not glamorous, but real, colonial survival did not come with spa amenities. You boil water carefully and encourage everyone to wash hands and faces. At least minimally, cleanliness, as much as possible, becomes another layer of defense. Outside, the snow reflects bright sunlight. The glare almost hurts your eyes. Snow blindness was a known risk in extreme conditions, though more common in Arctic regions. Still, prolonged exposure to bright reflection can cause discomfort. You squint and consider fashioning a crude shade from cloth when venturing far from the cabin. Your spouse prepares a thicker stew today, adding dried peas to stretch the salted meat. Protein matters more when illness threatens. You eat slowly, aware that each spoonful supports resilience. You assign lighter tasks to the children while they recover. Sorting beans, folding dried herbs, simple chores that keep hands moving but energy conserved. Inside the cabin, life shrinks into manageable routines: feed fire, check health, ration food, clear snow, rest, repeat. The cough improves slightly by evening. Relief washes through you quietly. You sit near the hearth, feeling the heat against your palms. The fire crackles steadily. The clay-sealed walls hold firm. Winter is still brutal, but not every threat announces itself with a blizzard. Some arrive as small coughs, dry throats, faint fevers. And survival depends on noticing them early. You tuck blankets carefully around your family that night. Outside, the snow gleams under a pale moon. Inside, warmth gathers around your small circle of light. The storm may have passed, but winter's quieter tests have only begun. The snow has a way of humbling you. After days of managing your own routines, wood, food, illness, you begin to realize that not all knowledge in this landscape started with you. In fact, almost none of it did. You step outside carefully, boots crunching against packed snow, and notice tracks you don't recognize. They're deliberate, straight, purposeful, not animal, not yours. Later that afternoon, you see him, a man from a nearby indigenous community, wrapped in layered hides, moving through snow with an ease that makes your heavy wool layers feel theatrical. He approaches without hurry. You nod respectfully. The truth is, many colonial families survived brutal winters not by sheer European grit alone, but by adopting indigenous techniques refined over centuries in this climate. One of the most well-known examples is the assistance given to the Plymouth colonists by Squanto, who taught them agricultural methods, including planting maize with fish as fertilizer. But survival knowledge extended far beyond planting. Historians still debate the full scope and reciprocity of these exchanges. How much knowledge was shared willingly? How much was born from necessity? And how these relationships evolved over time. But the practical impact is undeniable. You observe how he moves across snow wearing what appear to be snowshoes, broad wooden frames laced with rawhide. They distribute weight, preventing deep sinking. You glance at your boots buried halfway to the ankle and realize you've been doing winter the hard way. A lesser-known fact: snowshoes were widely used by indigenous peoples long before colonists adopted them. Without them, winter travel in deep snow could be nearly impossible. He gestures to your woodpile and nods approval. Then he points to the cabin roof. indicating where snow accumulation could become dangerous. You hadn't considered that too much weight might strain the structure. You thank him quietly. Later, you fashion a crude snow rake from a long pole to clear heavy buildup from the roof. Prevention is quieter than collapse. You also learn about insulating techniques, banking snow deliberately against the lower exterior walls of the cabin. Snow, counterintuitively, acts as insulation by trapping air within its layers. Instead of fighting it entirely, you use it strategically. Winter becomes less of an enemy and more of a complicated partner. A lesser-known survival detail: some indigenous groups stored food in underground caches lined with bark, preserving it effectively through cold months. You examine your own root cellar with new appreciation, realizing that subterranean storage is part of a broader winter wisdom. You exchange small goods, perhaps dried fish or woven cloth, in quiet acknowledgement of shared humanity. Survival in this landscape is rarely solitary, even when cabins stand far apart. Inside, you experiment with drying fish more thoroughly near the hearth after learning how smoke and airflow combine to preserve it longer. The process is slower than salting alone, but it adds resilience to your stores. Historians still argue about how early colonial narratives often minimized indigenous contributions to survival, framing endurance as purely European determination. You suspect pride sometimes edits memory. That evening, you attempt walking with makeshift snowshoes crafted from bent saplings and cordage. Your first steps are awkward. You wobble. The children laugh gently, but soon, you move more smoothly across the snow's surface. It feels almost magical, gliding instead of sinking. You think about how easily you could have dismissed local knowledge as foreign or unnecessary. Instead, it becomes one of your strongest defenses against isolation. Outside, the forest stands calm, white and silent, but you no longer feel entirely alone within it. Winter is still harsh. The cold still bites. The fire still demands feeding. But your methods have expanded. You return to the cabin at dusk, cheeks flushed from cold and effort. The hearth glows warmly. Your family gathers close. You realize something important. Survival in brutal winters isn't just about strength. It's about learning. And sometimes, humility keeps you warmer than wool. The snow outside has settled into a rhythm now, deep, quiet, patient, but your food stores do not share that patience. You kneel beside a barrel of cornmeal and lift the lid slowly, as if it might have multiplied overnight out of kindness. It has not. The surface sits lower than it did 2 weeks ago. Not alarmingly low, just noticeably lower. This is the point in winter when rationing becomes real. Not theoretical, not optimistic, real. You gather your family near the hearth and quietly adjust portions. Stews grow thinner. Bread loaves slightly smaller. Salted pork appears less frequently. No one complains. They understand the arithmetic. The first winter at Plymouth after 1620 remains one of the most cited examples of how brutal rationing could become. Nearly half the settlers died between December and March, weakened by exposure and limited food. Historians still debate whether their supplies were insufficient from the start or simply poorly distributed. But the result was unmistakable. Winter magnifies every shortage. You stir a pot of peas and barley slowly. Steam curls upward, carrying a modest aroma. It's not lavish, but it's warm. Warm counts. A lesser-known fact: Colonial families often relied on hasty pudding, a simple porridge made from cornmeal or other grains, boiled in water or milk. It was filling, inexpensive, and, let's say, nutritionally strategic. If you ate it daily, you'd probably develop a complicated emotional relationship with porridge. You cut dried apples into the stew to add a hint of sweetness. Innovation is sometimes just mixing things differently. Outside, snow remains heavy along the tree line. Hunting is possible but risky. Game grows scarce as winter deepens. And long treks in freezing conditions cost valuable calories. Every step burns energy you can't easily replace. You consider checking traps near the forest's edge. You strap on your awkward but improving snowshoes from Section 8 and move cautiously. The snow supports you better now. In one trap, you find a small rabbit. Not a feast, but a blessing. Colonial families supplemented winter stores with trapped game whenever possible. Even small animals contributed protein and fat that could stretch meals significantly. You carry it back carefully, aware that nothing goes to waste. The fur can be repurposed. The bones boiled for broth. Efficiency becomes instinct. Historians still debate how often winter hunting significantly reduced starvation risk versus simply delaying it. But you don't need statistics right now. You need broth. Back inside, you prepare the rabbit carefully, stretching it across multiple meals. No one expects abundance. They expect survival. As days shorten further, you mark time differently, not by dates, but by barrel levels, by woodpile height, by the weight of flour sacks. You also begin to ration firewood more precisely. Milder afternoons allow slightly smaller fires. You gather everyone closer to share warmth instead of heating unused corners of the cabin. A lesser-known winter strategy: some colonial families hung heavy curtains or blankets to partition sleeping areas, trapping heat within smaller spaces. You attempt this using spare wool fabric. The effect is modest, but noticeable. The cabin feels cozier in the sleeping corner now. Less open air to heat. Less wasted warmth. The children ask how much longer winter will last. You give an honest but gentle answer: longer than we want. Shorter than it feels. You remind yourself that February is often colder than December. Winter saves its sharpest edge for later. The stew simmers again tonight: peas, barley, thin slices of rabbit, a few dried herbs. Steam fogs the oiled paper window briefly before fading. Outside, the forest remains silent. Inside, spoons scrape wooden bowls quietly. You measure each bite not by taste, but by sustainability. The barrels are not empty. The fire still burns. But winter has shifted from dramatic storm to steady subtraction. And survival now depends on discipline as much as preparation. The monotony settles in before you fully notice it. At first, winter felt dramatic: blizzards, roaring wind, heroic wood chopping. Now it feels repetitive, quiet, the same stew simmering, the same fire tending, the same snow pressing softly against the cabin walls. You wake before dawn again. Not from panic but from habit. The hearth needs feeding. You kneel, stir embers, add 2 careful logs. The fire answers with a steady crackle. That sound has become reassurance itself. Breakfast is predictable: porridge, slightly thinner than last week. You stir it slowly, watching steam curl upward. The children eat without complaint. though you notice they chew more thoughtfully now. Colonial winter diets were famously repetitive. Salt pork, cornmeal, beans, dried fish, occasionally preserved fruit. Fresh greens were nearly non-existent unless someone had foresight to grow hardy winter crops like cabbage stored in root cellars. A lesser-known culinary detail: some families fermented cabbage into early forms of sauerkraut, which could last through winter and provide small but vital nutrients. Fermentation wasn't trendy, it was strategic. You check the salted pork hanging from the rafters. The strips have hardened, darkened slightly. Salt preservation works by drawing moisture out of meat, slowing bacterial growth. It's effective, but the flavor could politely be described as assertive. You slice a thin portion and soak it in water to reduce saltiness before cooking. Even small adjustments feel luxurious. Outside, the snow glitters under pale sunlight. The world looks peaceful enough to lull you into complacency. But you know better. In early colonial settlements, even one poorly timed supply delay could turn a manageable winter into crisis. Ships were often unable to dock due to frozen harbors or storms. Trade routes stalled. Historians still debate how often external resupply truly saved early colonies versus how often survival depended entirely on internal stores and local adaptation. You suspect pride sometimes credits ships when it should credit preparation. You decide to experiment with tonight's meal. You grind dried peas into a coarse flour and mix them with cornmeal for thicker cakes. They cook unevenly on the hearthstone, slightly smoky at the edges. You call them winter cakes with exaggerated pride. The children grin politely. They are kind critics. Food creativity becomes entertainment. The cabin feels smaller now. Weeks of snow have limited travel. Even with snowshoes, long journeys are risky and exhausting. The forest looks infinite but unreachable. Cabin fever, though unnamed, is real. Tempers occasionally flare over trivial matters. Who forgot to close the door quickly? Who used too much kindling? You intervene gently, redirecting frustration toward chopping wood or shelling beans. Historians still argue about the psychological toll of colonial winter isolation. Diaries from the period mention loneliness, spiritual doubt, and restlessness. Yet they also record resilience, faith, humor, stubborn endurance. You choose humor when possible. When the stew tastes particularly bland, you declare it the finest dish in 3 colonies. When the fire sputters, you joke that it's practicing dramatic pauses. Light laughter warms the air almost as much as flame. A lesser-known domestic trick: some families heated bricks near the hearth and wrapped them in cloth to place at the foot of beds before sleep. You try this tonight. The warmth lasts longer than expected, radiating gently through blankets. It feels like cheating winter just a little. The days blend together. You measure time by candle stubs growing shorter. Tallow drips unevenly down their sides, forming hardened trails. You begin marking notches on a beam near the hearth, one for each week endured. It's not scientific. It's symbolic. Outside, a fox crosses the clearing briefly, leaving delicate tracks in fresh powder. Wildlife grows bolder in winter, searching for food closer to settlements. You make a mental note to check traps again tomorrow. The barrels are lighter now. The woodpile slightly smaller, but still sufficient. Winter has shifted again, not a violent test. Not an immediate crisis, but a long negotiation. You negotiate with discipline, with rationing, with quiet humor. And each evening, as you bank the fire carefully and settle beneath wool blankets warmed by hearth-heated bricks, you realize something subtle but powerful. You are not merely surviving the storm. You are enduring the season. The hearth becomes more than a fire. It becomes the center of gravity. You notice it one morning while kneeling to stir the embers. Everything in your winter world orbits this stone-lined square. Meals begin here. Stories unfold here. Arguments soften here. Even silence gathers here. Without the hearth, the cabin would be little more than a wooden box slowly surrendering to cold. With it, the space feels almost alive. You adjust the iron pot hook carefully, suspending a kettle above steady flame. Colonial hearths were engineering feats in their own modest way. Large central chimneys in many New England homes were designed not just for cooking, but for radiating heat through adjacent rooms. Heat rose, stone absorbed it, and walls released it slowly. Primitive, yes, but thoughtful. A lesser-known detail, some larger colonial homes featured multiple fireboxes connected to the same central chimney stack, maximizing warmth distribution. In smaller cabins like yours, one hearth must serve every purpose: cooking, heating, light, even limited sanitation. You stir the pot slowly. Steam fogs the space above the fire, briefly blurring the cabin's rough beams. The smell of simmering peas mixes with wood smoke. It's a scent that has become synonymous with safety. Outside, snow still clings to the roof edges. You make a mental note to clear excess weight again tomorrow. Structural collapse is rare but not unheard of in heavy snow years. Historians still debate how much early colonial architecture evolved specifically in response to winter failures. Did design improvements come from disaster, or from gradual adaptation? Likely both. Experience teaches quickly when frost is involved. You kneel closer to the hearth, extending your hands toward the warmth. The heat radiates unevenly, hot near the flame, cooler at your back. You rotate like a slow-turning roast, equalizing exposure. Colonial central heating, version 1.0. Your spouse uses the hearthstones to bake simple flatbread directly on heated surfaces. The crust darkens unevenly, smoky at the edges. You brush off ash and call it rustic charm. The children gather near the firelight to carve small shapes from scrap wood, animals. Simple tools. Their hands move carefully in the glow. The hearth provides not just warmth, but visibility. Tallow candles are precious and saved for late evenings. A lesser-known winter technique, colonists often dried damp clothing on wooden racks suspended near, but not too near, the hearth. Too close, and sparks could ignite fabric. Too far, and moisture lingered. Balance remains the theme of winter. You reposition a damp wool sock slightly farther from the flame. You've learned that lesson once already. Fire also shapes your daily schedule. You cook larger meals when flames are strongest. You conserve fuel when the sun briefly warms the cabin. You plan tasks around the hearth's rhythm. You think about how different winter would feel without this steady flame. In regions farther north, some indigenous communities built longhouses designed to trap heat more efficiently than small drafty cabins. Architectural adaptation is survival logic. Historians still argue about how much colonial architecture borrowed from indigenous design principles over time. Particularly in harsher climates, survival often overrides pride. As evening falls, you bank the fire carefully again, covering hot coals with ash preserves embers until morning. It's an act of faith, trusting that the fire will survive the night just as you do. You sit beside it a little longer than necessary tonight, listening to the crackle. The cabin walls reflect soft orange light. Outside, the world remains frozen and distant. Inside, this hearth, built from stone you carried and clay you shaped, holds back the season. You realize something quietly profound. Winter is not defeated in one dramatic battle. It is held at bay each day, each hour, each carefully placed log. The hearth glows steadily, and you glow with it. The days grow shorter in a way that feels almost personal. You wake in darkness. You eat in dim light. You sleep before you're certain you're tired. The sun skims the horizon briefly, as if winter has placed it on a strict schedule. Colonial families in northern settlements experienced daylight shrinking to barely 9 hours in the depth of winter. And those 9 hours were often muted by cloud cover and snowfall. The rest of the day belonged to flame. You trim a tallow candle carefully with a small knife, shaving away hardened drips so it burns more evenly. Tallow, rendered from animal fat, was the most common candle material for ordinary households. It burned quickly and sometimes smoked, but it was accessible. Beeswax candles were cleaner and brighter, but far more expensive. Those were for churches or wealthier homes. A lesser-known fact, some colonial families reused candle stubs by melting them down and reforming new candles, refusing to waste even hardened scraps. In winter, light itself felt rationed. You light the candle as dusk falls, which feels like it happens immediately after midday. The small flame flickers, casting long shadows across the log walls. The oiled paper window reflects only darkness now. Without electric lighting, evenings stretch differently. There's no glowing clock to check, no late-night distractions, just conversation, handwork, and quiet thought. Historians still debate how winter darkness affected colonial mental health. Diaries from the era mention melancholy, spiritual introspection, and long hours of reflection. Some found comfort in it. Others found restlessness. You feel both. You sit near the hearth while your spouse mends clothing under candlelight. Needle moves slowly through thick wool. Every stitch matters. A small tear ignored today could become a frozen ankle tomorrow. The children shell dried beans into a wooden bowl. The soft tapping sound rhythmic and calming. You read aloud from a small Bible by candlelight. Words feel heavier in winter. Stories of endurance resonate more deeply when wind presses against your door. A lesser-known domestic detail, some families crafted rushlights, simple lighting devices made by dipping dried rush plants in animal fat. They burned dimly and briefly, but extended working hours without using precious candles. You experiment with one tonight. It sputters but glows faintly. Imperfect, but useful. Outside, the night is vast and cold. Stars appear sharp, almost aggressive in their clarity. Snow reflects moonlight faintly, making the world glow in pale blue. Inside, you rotate the heated brick from the hearth, wrapping it in cloth for bedtime. The simple warmth feels extravagant. The long darkness encourages reflection. You think about the early settlers who arrived without fully understanding how oppressive winter nights could feel. Some likely underestimated not just the cold, but the quiet. Historians still argue whether colonial communities relied more heavily on communal gatherings in winter precisely because darkness intensified isolation. Church meetings, shared meals, and storytelling helped puncture the silence. You plan to visit a nearby family once the snow crust hardens enough for easier travel. Shared company becomes medicine in its own way. For now, you extinguish the candle carefully, pinching the wick to preserve it. The cabin dims to ember glow. The hearth radiates faint warmth. Outside, winter holds the world in stillness. Inside, you settle beneath wool blankets, listening to the fire's last soft crackles. Darkness no longer feels threatening. It feels patient. And you, wrapped in layers and firelight memory, learn to be patient with it. You can't think only about your own warmth. Winter doesn't just test the cabin. It tests the barn. You step outside at first light. Breath fogging the air, snow crunching beneath your boots. The path to the small lean-to shelter where your livestock stay has narrowed from repeated use. Snowbanks rise on either side like silent walls. Inside, your two goats shuffle impatiently. Their breath hangs in the cold air, and frost clings faintly to the wooden beams. The cow shifts her weight slowly, conserving energy. Animals, like you, live in negotiation with winter. Colonial families depended heavily on livestock survival through winter. A single cow could mean milk, butter, cheese, and eventually meat. Lose the cow, and you lose not just food, but next year's resilience. You check the hay carefully. The stack is smaller than you'd like. Hay had to be cut and dried properly during summer and autumn. Poor harvests meant thinner feed supplies in February. Historians still debate how often livestock losses significantly contributed to colonial famine versus how often winter mortality was more heavily tied to crop failure. But diaries from early settlements frequently mention anxiety over animal feed running low. You break ice in the water trough with the back of your axe. The sound cracks sharply in the morning stillness. Frozen water is a daily problem now. Even wells can ice over in extreme cold. A lesser-known winter detail: some colonial farmers brought smaller animals like chickens into sheltered spaces closer to the home during severe cold to preserve egg production and reduce losses. You've moved your hens into a protected corner of the barn. Though egg supply has slowed dramatically, chickens are not enthusiastic about freezing mornings. You scatter measured handfuls of feed. No waste. Every kernel matters. The goats nibble steadily. Their calmness steadies you. Livestock often tolerate cold better than humans if sheltered from wind and provided sufficient food. Still, prolonged extreme cold can weaken even sturdy animals. You check the barn walls for drafts. Patch a small gap with bundled straw. Even animals deserve insulation upgrades. Outside, a faint set of tracks circles near the outer fence. Likely a fox, possibly something larger. Wolves occasionally approached colonial settlements during harsh winters. Drawn by livestock scent, predators, like humans, grow bolder when food is scarce. Historians still debate how significant predator threats truly were compared to popular imagination. Wolves were present, yes, but not every snowy howl signaled imminent attack. Fear, however, travels faster than facts. You reinforce the gate latch carefully. Simple wood and iron stand between your animals and hunger from the forest. Back at the cabin, you add more straw bedding near the sleeping area. Thick straw under blankets provides extra insulation from the cold earth. A lesser-known trick: some families rotated bedding periodically to prevent dampness buildup, which could steal warmth silently. You glance at the woodpile again. Slightly diminished, still sufficient. Winter now feels like a balancing act between humans and animals. Heat and feed, conservation and consumption. You remember reading about early Massachusetts settlers who lost livestock during particularly harsh winters, setting back farms by entire seasons. Recovery took months, sometimes years. You kneel briefly beside the hearth before lunch, hands extended toward flame. The cabin feels smaller but steady. You realize something simple: winter survival isn't one grand heroic act. It's dozens of small protections layered together. Patch the barn, break the ice, count the hay, secure the latch, feed the fire. The snow outside gleams under midday sun, deceptively bright. Inside, you plan tomorrow's tasks carefully. Because if your animals endure, your family's future endures with them. Water, which once felt abundant, has become stubborn. You step outside before breakfast, bucket in hand, and make your way toward the well. Snow crunches beneath your boots, the air sharp enough to sting your lungs. The rope creaks as you lower the bucket. It hits water, but the top layer has frozen thick enough to resist. You chip at it carefully with a small iron tool, breaking through the thin ice crust. The sound echoes faintly down the shaft. Even drawing water has become a choreographed act. Colonial winters frequently froze shallow wells, forcing families to rely on deeper sources or nearby streams. But streams, too, often iced over. Fetching water in January was less about convenience and more about persistence. Historians still debate how much time colonial households devoted daily to water retrieval during winter versus summer. In colder months, the effort certainly increased: ice removal, careful transport, preventing freezing indoors. Every gallon required strategy. You haul the bucket up slowly, careful not to spill. Water sloshes against the sides, already forming tiny crystals at the rim. You hurry back toward the cabin before the surface freezes again. Inside, you place the bucket near, but not too near, the hearth. Too close and it warms unevenly, too far and it freezes solid overnight. Balance, once again, is winter's quiet lesson. A lesser-known winter solution: some colonial families kept water in wooden barrels inside the cabin, insulated with cloth or straw to delay freezing. You wrap spare wool around your storage bucket, tucking it securely like a fragile treasure. The children complain mildly about washing hands in cold water. You warm a small portion in a kettle, rationing heat carefully. Hygiene still matters, even when comfort doesn't. Frozen laundry is another challenge. Wet cloth hung outdoors becomes stiff as boards within minutes. So you wash sparingly, prioritizing undergarments and essential layers. Damp fabric dries slowly indoors near the fire, filling the cabin with a faint steamy chill. You remember accounts from early settlers describing how even ink froze in inkwells during severe cold snaps. Writing letters in January required thawing materials first. Historians still argue whether colonial winters in certain decades were particularly extreme compared to modern averages, especially during the Little Ice Age. Climate records reconstructed from tree rings and ice cores suggest prolonged colder intervals, but daily lived experience likely felt harsher than any statistic can capture. You test the small stream beyond the tree line one afternoon. Wearing your improved snowshoes from Section 8. The surface is mostly frozen. But near a bend, water trickles slowly beneath thin ice. You break through and fill a smaller container. Running water, even limited, feels like a gift. A lesser-known detail: some settlers melted snow for water in emergencies. But snow yields surprisingly little liquid compared to its volume. Melting it also consumes precious firewood. It's a last resort, not a primary plan. Back inside, you measure how much water remains in your indoor barrel. You calculate daily needs: drinking, cooking, minimal washing. Water becomes another ration. You sit by the hearth again, watching steam rise from the kettle. It curls upward, vanishing near the chimney's draft. The cabin smells faintly of damp wool and smoke. Outside, the snow glows blue in late afternoon light. Winter's brutality isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's simply persistent inconvenience: frozen ropes, icy buckets, stiff fingers gripping wood handles. But inconvenience compounds. You tuck the wrapped water barrel closer to the inner wall, away from the draft-prone door. Tomorrow, you'll chip ice again, and the day after that. Because in colonial winter, even water must be fought for gently, one frozen surface at a time. The walls begin to feel closer. Not physically, they haven't shifted. But emotionally, the cabin tightens around you like a wool coat pulled a bit too snug. Weeks of snow have narrowed your world to hearth, barn, well, and back again. You wake one morning and notice the silence feels heavier. No storm, no urgent task, just the steady sameness of winter pressing in. Cabin fever is not a modern invention. Colonial diaries occasionally mention restlessness during prolonged winter isolation, irritability, melancholy, even small disputes magnified by proximity. Historians still debate how deeply winter confinement affected colonial mental health compared to the more immediate threats of hunger and cold. But human temperament does not freeze simply because survival is at stake. You feel it today when a minor disagreement over firewood stacking becomes sharper than it should. A log placed incorrectly, a door left open a second too long. Words rise quickly, then hang awkwardly in the cold air. You take a breath, step outside, let the air sting your cheeks and reset your thoughts. The clearing is bright under winter sun. Snow sparkles with almost defiant cheerfulness. You realize the landscape is wide, even if your daily routine isn't. A lesser-known winter practice: some colonial families deliberately scheduled communal visits during milder stretches of weather to combat isolation. Even short social interactions could ease psychological strain. You decide that once the snow crust hardens enough to support easier travel, you'll visit the neighboring family you've seen only from a distance. Shared stew tastes better than solitary stew. Inside, you reorganize small tasks to create rhythm. The children practice reading by candlelight. Your spouse spins wool beside the hearth. You carve small wooden pegs to repair a loose hinge. Purpose becomes medicine. Colonial winter life often revolved around indoor crafts: spinning, knitting, tool repair, activities that strengthened both supplies and sanity. Idle hands invited anxious thoughts. Busy hands steadied them. You begin telling longer stories in the evenings, tales of arrival, of autumn harvest, of the first snowfall from Section 3 that felt almost charming compared to this long endurance. Laughter returns, softer this time. A lesser-known detail, some colonial households marked days by religious observances or simple calendar tallies carved into beams or boards. You glance at your own notches from Section 10. They reassure you. Progress exists, even if it's slow. You also notice how physical closeness shapes mood. Shared sleeping spaces, shared warmth, shared silence. Winter strips away privacy but also reinforces connection. Historians still argue whether colonial families emerged from winter stronger or merely relieved. Perhaps both. Survival often forges quiet bonds not easily explained. The afternoon light fades early again. You step outside briefly to clear the barn path. Breathing deeply, the air feels sharper but not hostile. When you return inside, you bring with you a small bundle of evergreen branches. You hang them near the doorway, not just for mild fragrance, but for visual variety, a reminder that green still exists somewhere beyond white. The cabin feels subtly different now. Not larger, but lighter. You kneel at the hearth once more, adjusting embers carefully. The fire responds with steady warmth. Winter remains long, but you begin to understand that survival isn't only physical. It's emotional endurance too. And sometimes, stepping outside for one deep breath of frozen air is enough to widen the walls again. The children feel winter differently than you do. You notice it in the way they press their faces against the oiled paper window, tracing small circles in the condensation. To you, snow means rationing and wood counts. To them, it means a landscape transformed. You hesitate before allowing them outside. Cold can be merciless, but controlled exposure builds resilience. You bundle them carefully, wool layers from Section 5, mittens dried near the hearth from Section 11, scarves wrapped snugly. They step into the snow cautiously at first. Then with delight, their boots sink. They laugh. One attempts to shape a crude snow figure near the barn. It leans awkwardly. You approve anyway. Colonial children were not shielded from winter realities. They carried water, gathered kindling, and tended small chores even in harsh conditions. Childhood included responsibility early and often. Historians still debate how much colonial childhood differed emotionally from modern expectations versus simply structurally. Work was expected, but joy was not absent. You supervise from a short distance, axe resting against your shoulder. You scan for frostbite risk, exposed cheeks, reddening fingertips. Play is permitted, negligence is not. A lesser-known winter fact, some colonial communities held informal sleigh gatherings once snow packed firmly enough, using simple sleds to travel between homesteads. Snow, when stable, became a road instead of an obstacle. You help the children fashion a small wooden sled from scrap boards. It's crude but functional. They take turns sliding down a gentle slope near the clearing. Laughter echoes briefly across the frozen air. The sound surprises you. It feels almost rebellious against the silence of winter. Back inside, you warm their hands slowly near the fire. Too rapid heating can sting painfully. They chatter about snow tracks and the shape of icicles hanging from the eaves. You serve them warm broth. It tastes the same as yesterday's broth. They drink it enthusiastically anyway. Hunger sharpens appreciation. You reflect on how colonial education often continued through winter evenings, reading scripture, practicing penmanship, learning arithmetic by candlelight. You pull out a small slate board and guide them through simple sums. A lesser-known detail: some colonial schools operated seasonally, with winter often being a more common time for boys to attend formal lessons. Since farm labor was lighter, learning and survival intertwined closely. You listen to their recitations softly. The cabin, once oppressive with isolation, now hums gently with life. Outside, a faint animal call drifts from the forest, perhaps a fox again from Section 9. The world beyond your walls continues its own winter routine. Historians still argue whether harsh winters accelerated maturity in colonial children or whether adaptation simply became second nature. Perhaps they never knew a different rhythm. You watch the children trace shapes in frost on the interior wall near the door. Their breath fogs and fades. Their laughter quiets gradually as evening approaches. The hearth crackles steadily. The heated brick waits by the fire for bedtime. Winter remains severe. Food remains measured. Wood remains finite. But the cabin feels warmer tonight, not because the temperature changed, but because laughter briefly filled it. You bank the fire carefully again. And you realize that even in brutal winters, small joys are not luxuries. They are fuel of another kind. Sunday arrives without fanfare. Winter does not soften for it. You wake before dawn, as always, feeding the hearth, checking the water barrel from Section 14, glancing at the woodpile from Section 4. The rituals do not pause for worship. But today, you prepare differently. You brush snow from your heavier cloak and wrap wool layers tightly. The meeting house stands a short distance away, far enough that the walk requires commitment, close enough that community still feels reachable. Colonial communities in New England often gathered weekly for worship regardless of weather. Attendance was expected, and sermons could last hours. In unheated buildings. In winter, yes, hours. Historians still debate how attendance was enforced socially versus spiritually in early settlements. But records show that even in deep snow, families made the journey. Faith was considered a pillar of endurance. You step outside, breath rising in pale clouds. The snow crust supports your steps more easily now. Hardened by repeated freezing and thawing, the path between cabins has been trampled into a narrow white corridor. You see neighbors emerging from their homes, similarly layered, faces half hidden beneath scarves. No one speaks loudly. Sound carries strangely in cold air. The meeting house stands plain and sturdy. No elaborate decoration. No comforting warmth waiting inside. You enter and immediately feel the difference. The interior air is colder than your cabin. Wooden benches offer no padding, no insulation. You sit close to your family for shared warmth. A lesser-known winter practice, in some colonial churches, families brought small foot warmers, wooden boxes filled with hot coals, to place near their feet during services. You fashioned something similar from scrap wood and embers carefully banked before leaving. It radiates gentle heat under the bench. Practical piety. The sermon begins. The minister's breath fogs as he speaks. Words about endurance, providence, community. They resonate differently when you've spent weeks negotiating with winter. You glance around the room. Faces are drawn but steady. No one appears surprised by hardship. Historians still argue how much winter hardship reinforced religious devotion versus tested it. For some, brutal seasons strengthened faith. For others, doubt crept in quietly with the cold. You listen carefully. The message emphasizes preparation and perseverance, virtues you've practiced daily since Section 1. The service stretches long. Your feet grow numb despite the foot warmer. The children fidget, then settle. Even discomfort feels communal. Afterward, brief conversation fills the doorway. News exchanged softly. A neighbor mentions losing a hen to frost. Another reports that his well froze completely for 2 days. Shared hardship creates its own currency. A lesser-known detail: winter gatherings often served as informal information exchanges, weather conditions, trade rumors, minor illnesses spreading through households. Community functioned as early warning system. You walk home slowly, snow crunching underfoot. The sky remains pale and low. Back inside your cabin, the hearth welcomes you like an old friend. You add logs carefully, coaxing flame higher. The meeting house may have been cold, but it reminded you of something important. You are not alone in this season. Winter isolates, yes, but it also gathers. You sit by the fire and reflect quietly. Faith, whether spiritual or simply communal, becomes another layer of insulation. Outside, the forest stands unchanged. Inside, warmth spreads again through wool, flame, and shared memory of voices echoing in a frozen room. The day ends like the others, with careful banking of embers and layered blankets. But tonight, the silence feels less solitary. Trade does not disappear in winter. It simply becomes complicated. You stand at the edge of the clearing one crisp morning, scanning the narrow path that leads toward the nearest trading post miles away. Snow still blankets the ground, but it has hardened enough in places to support sled travel. Colonial settlements often depended on limited winter trade, especially for items not easily produced at home: salt, iron tools, fabric, gunpowder. But winter storms and frozen waterways could interrupt supply lines unpredictably. Historians still debate how robust colonial trade networks truly were during severe winters. Some records suggest resilience, others hint at fragile dependence on seasonal shipping. Either way, a missed shipment could ripple through households quickly. You've inventoried your supplies carefully. Salt is running low. Your axe head shows wear. You need a small quantity of nails for minor repairs. None of these shortages are catastrophic, yet. But winter is long, and preparation never truly ends. You harness a small sled fashioned from planks and rope. It's not elegant, but it slides smoothly over packed snow. A lesser-known winter advantage: frozen ground often made overland travel easier for heavy goods. Since mud and uneven terrain were temporarily subdued beneath ice, snow can isolate, but it can also smooth. You wrap your scarf tighter and begin the trek. The air is still, almost brittle. Every breath feels sharp but manageable. The forest along the path stands tall and quiet, branches laced with frost. You listen for signs of wildlife, movement in brush, distant calls. Winter travel requires alertness, but also calm. Panic wastes energy. After what feels like hours but is likely less, you reach the modest trading outpost. A few other settlers stand outside, stamping their feet for warmth. Inside, the space is crowded and cold. Trade is brisk, practical, efficient. Salt is measured carefully, iron goods examined closely. No one lingers unnecessarily. A lesser-known historical detail, in some regions, winter pelts, particularly beaver and fox, were highly valued in trade during colder months, feeding broader colonial fur markets. Trapping became both survival supplement and economic opportunity. You exchange modest goods, perhaps a small bundle of dried herbs and preserved meat, for salt and a handful of nails. It's not a windfall, but it reinforces stability. Historians still argue about how winter trade influenced colonial expansion patterns, whether settlements clustered near trade routes for survival advantages or gradually pushed farther outward as self-sufficiency improved. Geography shaped resilience. You begin the return journey before the sun dips too low. Winter daylight is unforgiving. Halfway home, clouds gather unexpectedly. Snow begins again, not a blizzard, but steady and thick. Visibility shortens. You focus on the path markers you learned to recognize earlier in the season. A bent tree here, a distinct rock there. A lesser-known travel tactic. Some colonial paths were marked subtly by carved blazes on tree trunks to guide travelers in heavy snow. You spot one now, reassuring and quiet. The sled glides smoothly behind you. Salt secured tightly beneath cloth. By the time you reach your clearing, twilight has settled. The cabin glows faintly through oiled paper. Firelight flickering within. Inside, warmth greets you like reward. You unpack salt carefully, storing it near the hearth for dryness. The nails join your modest repair pile. Trade has reminded you of something important. Winter may isolate individual cabins, but settlements remain linked by necessity. You kneel to feed the hearth once more, listening to the crackle. Outside, snow falls gently again. Inside, you feel steadier, not because winter has softened, but because you have extended your circle slightly beyond the clearing. And in brutal winters, connection is as valuable as salt. By now, you've stopped pretending this is an ordinary winter. The cold has a depth to it, an edge that lingers even when the wind is calm. The snowpack is thicker than you remember from previous years. The river near the trading path from Section 18 is frozen nearly solid. Even midday light seems reluctant to warm anything fully. You are living, whether you realize it or not, in the tail end of what historians call the Little Ice Age, a climatic period stretching roughly from the 14th to the mid-19th century, marked by cooler temperatures across parts of the Northern Hemisphere. Colonial winters during this era could be especially severe. Rivers froze deeper, snow lingered longer, growing seasons shortened unpredictably. Historians still debate the exact causes of the Little Ice Age: volcanic activity, solar variation, ocean circulation shifts. But for you, standing in knee-deep snow, the cause matters less than the consequence. You step outside early, scanning the horizon. The air feels almost metallic in your lungs. Even your breath seems slower. A lesser-known detail, during colder stretches of the Little Ice Age, some harbors in New England reportedly froze enough to disrupt maritime trade for extended periods. Ships became trapped or delayed. Winter could isolate coastal settlements as effectively as inland ones. You tighten your cloak and make your way to the barn. The animals move more slowly now, conserving energy. Haystacks have shrunk again. You calculate feed with careful arithmetic. The cabin's interior temperature feels slightly lower this week. Even with steady fire tending, you increase insulation along the north-facing wall, packing additional straw behind hanging hides. Small adjustments accumulate into survival. You recall how in Section 4 you worried about the woodpile's size. Now you worry about its rate of decline. Firewood disappears faster during prolonged deep freezes. The hearth must burn hotter to maintain the same indoor comfort. You adjust feeding intervals carefully, adding smaller logs more frequently rather than large ones all at once. Historians still argue how colonial settlements adapted architecturally to repeated harsh winters. Over time, homes grew more compact, chimneys more central, insulation more intentional. Hard seasons leave design lessons. Inside, you prepare a thicker stew tonight, using the last of the dried apples from Section 3. Their sweetness has faded, but they soften the salt pork's intensity. A lesser-known winter reality, vitamin deficiencies could quietly emerge during prolonged winters with limited fresh produce. Scurvy was more associated with maritime voyages. But nutritional imbalance was not unknown on land either. Fermented vegetables and stored roots helped mitigate this. If available, you glance at your remaining turnips in the cellar. They are softening but usable. You'll incorporate them tomorrow. Outside, the sky shifts from pale gray to a colder blue. The wind rises briefly, then settles again. The forest looks almost suspended in frost. You feel the weight of the season, not dramatic fear, but sustained endurance. Historians still debate whether colonial mortality spikes during colder decades can be directly correlated with climatic data. Numbers tell part of the story. Diaries tell another. You don't need charts. You feel the data in your hands. In the diminishing hay. In the careful slicing of pork. In the measured distribution of heat. You sit beside the hearth longer tonight, watching the flames dance along oak logs. The fire remains your most reliable ally. Winter has not broken you, but it has made itself known, deeply, thoroughly, without apology. You pull your blanket tighter and listen to the quiet. Somewhere beyond the tree line, the frozen river rests under thick ice. Inside, your family breathes steadily. The little ice age may shape the climate, but you shape your response, log by log, meal by meal, day by day. Snow, which has tested you all season, reveals a softer side today. You step outside at midday and notice something different, not in the temperature, which remains sharp, but in the way sunlight touches the drifts. The snowbanks that once felt like barriers now gleam almost warmly. You crouch and press your hand into a drift along the cabin wall. Beneath the crusted surface, it feels compact and dense. It occurs to you that snow, for all its hostility, has been insulating your cabin this entire time. Packed against the lower logs, it traps air and blocks wind from slipping through the cracks you sealed back in Section 2. A lesser-known winter truth: snow is actually a surprisingly effective insulator. Igloos, though not part of your colonial design, demonstrate this principle beautifully. Snow traps tiny air pockets that reduce heat transfer. The very thing that buries your door also shields your walls. You decide to reinforce this accidental advantage. Using a shovel, you gently bank additional snow along the cabin's base where wind exposure is strongest. You shape it deliberately now, not as obstruction, but as armor. Colonial settlers often learned to work with winter conditions rather than against them entirely. Historians still debate how quickly European settlers adapted to local environmental knowledge. But necessity is an efficient teacher. You glance toward the barn. The snow between cabin and shelter is packed into a firm, reliable path. Travel is easier than during the loose powder days of Section 6. Snow has transformed the ground into a smoother surface for sled movement. Just as you discovered during the trading journey in Section 18. Frozen terrain simplifies certain burdens while complicating others. Inside, you notice another benefit. The cabin feels marginally warmer today. Despite using slightly less firewood, the snowbanks are doing part of the work. You adjust the hearth carefully, adding smaller logs. Conservation becomes instinctive now. The children step outside briefly, testing the crusted snow surface. It supports them better than before. One slides carefully across a shallow drift. Laughing, winter, once again, refuses to be only one thing. A lesser-known practice in some northern settlements, families carved narrow winter paths through snow that gradually compacted into stable corridors, reducing exposure to wind and easing daily chores. Your clearing has begun forming these natural corridors through repeated use. You walk the perimeter of your small homestead, noting how snow piles protect certain areas from harsh wind gusts. Even the woodpile benefits from careful coverage, preventing melt and refreeze cycles that could dampen fuel. Historians still argue whether particularly snowy winters were ultimately worse or better than colder, drier ones. Heavy snow could isolate, but it also insulated crops, cabins, and root cellars from deeper frost penetration. You check the cellar from Section 3. The snow above it remains thick, acting as an extra blanket. Inside, the temperature feels steady. The remaining turnips have not frozen solid. You return to the hearth with a small sense of quiet satisfaction. Winter is still long, supplies are still measured, but today, you feel less attacked and more aligned. You prepare a simple meal again, turnip stew thickened with peas. The flavor is modest, but warming. Outside, the snow glows under pale sunlight, reflecting brightness into the cabin. Even through the oiled paper window, the light feels amplified. You sit by the fire and realize something subtle. Survival in brutal winters isn't only about resisting nature. Sometimes it's about recognizing when nature is quietly helping you, if you're willing to see it. The snow rests peacefully along your walls. And for the first time in days, winter feels less like an adversary and more like a complicated companion. Companionship with winter is easier in daylight. At night, the forest changes its tone. You wake to a distant sound, long, low, carrying across frozen air. It's not wind. It's not the creak of timber. It's something alive. You sit up slowly, listening. Another call follows. Then a second. Higher, answering from deeper in the woods. Wolves. Colonial records from New England and other northern settlements mention wolves frequently during harsh winters. When deer grew scarce and snow deepened, predators sometimes ventured closer to livestock and human habitation. Historians still debate how significant wolf attacks truly were compared to the fear they inspired. Fatal encounters were rare, but livestock losses did occur. And fear, amplified by darkness and cold, carries weight of its own. You rise quietly and move toward the door. careful not to disturb the children. The hearth glows faintly. You add a small log, not for warmth alone, but for reassurance. Firelight deters more than frostbite. You step outside briefly, breath rising into the black sky. Moonlight reflects sharply off snow, illuminating the clearing in pale silver. The barn stands quiet. You listen again. The howls echo from a distance, not close enough for immediate danger, but near enough to remind you that hunger drives more than humans in winter. A lesser-known winter detail: in some colonial settlements, families hung small bells or fashioned noise-making devices near barns to alert them if predators disturbed livestock at night. You consider adding something similar to your gate latch. You circle the barn carefully, checking the fence line. The snow around it remains undisturbed. Relief settles into your shoulders. Back inside, you secure the door and sit near the hearth for a moment longer. The wolves call once more, fainter now. You reflect on how thin the line feels between settlement and wilderness in winter. The cabin, the barn, the woodpile, they are small islands carved from forest. Beyond them, the land belongs to older rhythms. Historians still argue whether early colonial expansion dramatically reduced wolf populations through hunting and habitat disruption over time. But in these early decades, the forest still speaks loudly. You bank the fire again and lie down, listening. The howls eventually fade. Morning arrives crisp and clear. You inspect the snow carefully for tracks. Near the tree line, you find them, large paw prints pressed deep into powder. They circled briefly, then turned away. A reminder, not an attack. You reinforce the barn latch with an extra length of rope from section 13. You clear the path again, stamping it firm. Winter is not only cold and hunger. It is proximity to wildlife, to darkness, to uncertainty. But you are not defenseless. You carry knowledge from previous sections: insulated walls, rationed food, reinforced barns, community connections. The wolves retreat for now. The forest resumes its quiet watch. Inside the cabin, the hearth glows steadily once more. And you realize that even predators, drawn close by winter's scarcity, are part of the same seasonal negotiation you are enduring. Midwinter settles in like a long breath you didn't realize you were holding. The days are still short, but something subtle shifts. The calendar, though you barely consult it, whispers that you are somewhere near the heart of the season. In many colonial communities, Christmas passed quietly during certain periods, especially in Puritan New England, where it was not widely celebrated in the early 17th century. In fact, Christmas observance was once discouraged or even banned in Massachusetts Bay in the mid-1600s. Winter was for discipline, not decoration. Historians still debate how strictly such bans were enforced and how private households marked the season regardless. Human beings tend to find small celebrations even when public ones are frowned upon. You decide to create a modest observance of your own, not grand, not extravagant, just enough to acknowledge the turning of time. You bring evergreen branches indoors again, this time arranging them more deliberately above the hearth. Their scent cuts gently through the smoke. Green against brown logs and gray clay feels like defiance. A lesser-known winter detail, in some European traditions carried to the colonies. Evergreen branches symbolized endurance and life persisting through cold months. Even if not universally practiced, the idea traveled quietly with settlers. You prepare a slightly more generous meal tonight. Not abundant, your barrels from Section 9 would protest, but thoughtful. A thicker stew. The last of the dried apples stirred in. A small portion of preserved meat saved intentionally for this moment. The children notice immediately. Their eyes brighten at the slightly richer aroma. You light 2 candles instead of 1. The cabin glows warmer, not in temperature, but in mood. You share stories, not of hardship, but of arrival in autumn, of the first snowfall that seemed beautiful before it became relentless, of the blizzard from Section 6 that tested your roof but did not break it. You remind each other how far you've come since Section 1, when the cabin was little more than a suggestion. Historians still argue whether winter celebrations meaningfully improved morale in colonial households or whether daily survival left little energy for ritual. But you suspect even modest observances mattered deeply. A lesser-known practice, some families reserved small treats, molasses cakes, dried fruit, or spiced cider, for rare midwinter gatherings, stretching limited stores carefully to mark the calendar's turn. You warm a small mug of cider gently over the fire, thinning it with water but preserving the scent. Outside, the forest remains silent and pale under moonlight. Wolves do not howl tonight. The snow reflects candlelight faintly through the window. You feel something different, less urgency, more steadiness. Winter is still long, supplies are still finite, but you are no longer reacting to each day as crisis. You are living within it. You pass around small wooden cups of warmed cider. The sweetness is faint but welcome. The children fall asleep a little earlier tonight, cheeks flushed from firelight. You sit beside the hearth after they settle, staring into embers. The fire has become an old companion now, predictable, faithful, demanding but fair. Winter may be brutal, but it is not endless. And tonight, in this small cabin layered with wool, snow-banked walls, and quiet gratitude, you allow yourself a brief sense of celebration, not because winter is over, but because you are still here in its center. When the celebration fades, the work remains. Winter does not care that you warmed cider last night. It resumes its steady subtraction of stores and strength. You wake to another pale morning and reach instinctively for the notches carved into the beam from Section 10. You count them again, more behind you now than ahead. That realization steadies you. But winter has a final cruelty. It stretches longest when you think you've mastered it. You lift the lid on the grain barrel again. The bottom is visible now. Not empty, but no longer generous. You measure portions more carefully than ever. Late winter hunger was common in colonial settlements. Even well-prepared households sometimes found February and March the leanest months. When autumn harvests had dwindled and spring planting remained weeks away. Historians still debate how frequently late winter shortages tipped into true famine in established colonies compared to the early catastrophic winters like Jamestown's starving time. Established farms fared better, but vulnerability never disappeared entirely. You thin the stew further tonight, stretching peas and turnips with extra water from Section 14. It tastes lighter. No one comments. Everyone notices. A lesser-known survival tactic, some colonial families ground acorns into flour during lean periods after leaching out bitterness. It required careful preparation but offered supplemental calories when other stores ran low. You consider testing it if your barrels shrink further. The goats in the barn move slower now. Haystacks have dropped to worrying levels. You ration their feed as carefully as your own meals. The cow's ribs show slightly more than you'd prefer. You remember the wolves from section 21 and double-check the gate again. Losing livestock now would be devastating. Snow remains thick in shaded areas. But you notice something subtle. Icicles drip faintly at midday. A sound like distant ticking. The sun lingers seconds longer each afternoon. You stand outside one day and tilt your face toward it. The warmth is minimal, but present. Historians still argue whether colonists marked seasonal changes consciously or simply endured until visible transformation forced acknowledgement. But you feel it now, a shift too small to celebrate. Too real to ignore. Inside, tempers feel thinner than in December. Fatigue accumulates in late winter. You respond with patience where possible. Humor where necessary. Silence when wise. The children ask when fresh greens will return. You smile and answer honestly, soon. Not tomorrow, but soon. A lesser-known winter fact: some settlers sprouted small batches of grains indoors to create limited fresh shoots during winter months. The yield was modest but symbolically powerful. You experiment with a small tray of soaked barley near the hearth. Tiny green tips appear within days. The sight feels miraculous. You serve them sparingly, one small handful each. Freshness in the depth of winter tastes almost electric. You check the woodpile again. Reduced, but still serviceable. You have judged fairly. At night, you lie awake listening to the quieter forest. The wolves have not returned recently. Perhaps prey has shifted. Perhaps winter itself is loosening its grip. The cabin feels worn but intact. The clay seams hold. The roof has not sagged. The hearth continues its steady work. You reflect on how many colonial families endured this same late winter narrowing of resources. Some succeeded, some did not. Historians still debate whether sheer wool or structural preparation mattered more. But from where you lie, under wool blankets warmed by a heated brick, you suspect it was both, plus something harder to quantify. Patience. You close your eyes, listening to the soft crackle of embers. The season has not defeated you. But it is not finished yet. The cold changes before you notice it fully. It is still winter. The snow still covers the clearing. The forest remains pale and restrained. But something in the air shifts, less metallic, less biting. You step outside one morning and hear it, dripping. A faint, irregular rhythm from the eaves. Water falling from icicles that once stood rigid and unmoving. The sound is small, almost shy, but it is unmistakable. The thaw has begun. Late winter and early spring in colonial settlements were not gentle transitions. Thaw meant mud. Melted snow turned packed paths into slick trenches. Travel that had become manageable on frozen ground now turned treacherous. Historians still debate whether the thaw was more dangerous than the deepest cold. Frozen stability gave way to unstable footing. Rivers swelled. Roofs leaked. Root cellars risked flooding. You walk carefully toward the barn. Boots sinking into slushy snow that grabs at each step. The goats seem restless. The cow shifts eagerly. Animals sense seasonal shifts before you fully trust them. You inspect the roofline again. Meltwater drips steadily, carving shallow channels through the snowbanks you built in Section 20. You shovel excess accumulation away from the cabin walls to prevent pooling. Snow once insulated you, now water threatens your foundation. A lesser-known colonial challenge, mud season, could isolate settlements just as effectively as blizzards. Wagons sank, horses struggled, trade routes stalled again, this time not because of ice, but because of mire. Inside, you open the door slightly longer than before, allowing fresher air to circulate. It smells different now, less frozen, more earthy. Damp wood and thawing soil carry a faint scent of renewal. You check the root cellar from section 3. The remaining vegetables have softened further. You prioritize using them before rot sets in. Late winter meals shift subtly, less about stretching, more about finishing what remains. Historians still argue whether colonial families felt greater anxiety during late winter scarcity or cautious optimism as thaw approached. Perhaps both emotions coexisted, braided together like straw insulation in your walls. The children venture outside cautiously, testing patches of exposed ground. They find small areas where snow has receded entirely, revealing brown grass beneath. They call it discovery. You call it hope. A lesser-known spring indicator, colonists often listened for the return of certain bird calls as signals that the harshest cold had passed. You pause one afternoon and hear faint chirping near the tree line. Subtle, but new. You reduce the fire slightly during midday. The hearth still burns each night, but less aggressively. Woodpile anxiety eases marginally. You have managed well. The well from section 14 flows more easily now. Ice no longer seals the surface. Water retrieval becomes simpler. But thaw brings new chores. You repair sections of fence loosened by snow pressure. You clear drainage channels around the cabin. You inspect tools dulled by months of heavy use. Winter may be retreating, but its wear remains visible. You kneel near the clearing's edge one afternoon and touch the damp soil. It is still cold, but softer. Historians still debate how quickly colonial farmers began spring preparations after severe winters. Timing was critical. Plant too early, and frost could destroy seedlings. Wait too long, and the growing season shortens dangerously. You feel that calculation forming already in your mind. Seeds will soon matter more than salt. For now, though, you stand in the melting snow and listen to water dripping steadily from your roof. It is not dramatic, it is not triumphant, but it is movement. And after months of frozen stillness, movement feels like grace. The thaw does not mean relief. It means reckoning. As snow retreats into uneven patches, the land reveals what winter concealed. You step carefully through mud that grips your boots with stubborn suction. The clearing looks smaller somehow, branches broken from snow weight, fence posts leaning slightly, straw scattered and damp. Winter has left its fingerprints everywhere. You begin by counting quietly. The goats are thinner but steady. The cow survived. The hens, fewer eggs, but alive. You exhale slowly. Livestock endurance alone feels like a small miracle. Colonial records often note that late winter was the most fragile period, not because of storms, but because reserves were lowest and bodies were weakest. The term, hungry gap, was used in later agricultural communities to describe this stretch before new crops arrived. Historians still debate how frequently late winter malnutrition shaped long-term health outcomes in colonial settlements. The evidence is incomplete. But the pattern of scarcity is clear. You inventory your stores again. The grain barrel is nearly empty. Salt remains, though reduced. Dried peas are sparse. The root cellar has only a handful of softened turnips left. But you are not empty. The small tray of barley shoots from section 23 has grown taller. Pale green blades stretch upward near the hearth. You trim them carefully, adding a fresh edge to the evening stew. The taste is faint, but transformative. A lesser-known colonial detail, early spring foraging often supplemented dwindling stores. Nettles, early greens, and tree buds provided small bursts of nutrients before full planting season began. You scan the edges of the clearing for signs of such growth. Snowmelt swells the nearby stream, turning its slow trickle into a lively current. Water, once frozen and stubborn, now moves freely. You kneel beside it, cupping your hands in the cold flow. You begin planning the fields. The soil remains damp and heavy, not yet ready for planting. But you clear debris and fallen branches, preparing space for seed. Historians still argue how quickly colonial families could rebound agriculturally after particularly severe winters. Much depended on timing, seed quality, and sheer energy left after months of strain. Energy is something you measure carefully now. You feel it in your limbs, stronger than February. But still cautious. Inside the cabin, you open the door wider during the day. Fresh air replaces months of smoke-laced breath. The walls feel less close. The ceiling beams no longer trap gloom. The children run farther into the clearing now. Boots splashing in mud, they discover patches of exposed earth and treat them like treasure. You repair the sled from section 16, storing it away for next winter. You mend wool layers from section 5, folding them carefully. Winter garments retreat to corners. Though not too far, experience teaches humility. A lesser-known seasonal reality, many colonial families began spinning and weaving intensively during winter so that spring and summer labor could focus entirely on fields. The cloth repaired in January now serves in April. You glance at the notches carved into the beam from section 10. They tell the story of endurance more honestly than any diary might. Outside, birdsong grows slightly louder each day. The forest shifts from silence to murmur. Winter did not spare you hardship. It did not grant abundance. But it did not defeat you either. You stand at the edge of the clearing at dusk, watching the last of the snow recede into shadow. The ground beneath it is wet, messy, imperfect, and alive. The mud clings to everything. You step outside before sunrise, boots already damp from yesterday's thaw, and realize that frozen stability has given way to something trickier. The ground sucks at your heels. The path to the barn from section 13 is no longer a clean corridor of packed snow, it's a narrow river of brown slush. If winter was a test of endurance, early spring is a test of patience. Colonial diaries occasionally mention this period with equal parts relief and frustration. Snow gone meant warmth returning, but it also meant flooding, unstable roads, and the risk of spoiled stores. Historians still debate whether the mud season slowed agricultural recovery significantly in harsher years or whether settlers simply adapted quickly out of necessity. From where you stand, ankle deep in thaw, adaptation feels less theoretical and more immediate. You inspect the cabin's foundation carefully. Meltwater has pooled near the north wall despite your snowbank insulation from Section 20. You dig a shallow trench with your spade, redirecting runoff away from the logs. Wood rot is a quiet enemy, slow, invisible, but destructive if ignored. A lesser-known colonial detail, early settlers often elevated cabins slightly or built simple drainage ditches around them after learning the hard way how destructive spring melt could be. Trial and error shaped architecture as much as climate. Inside, the air feels different now, less smoky, more damp. You open both the door and window flap briefly to allow cross-breeze ventilation. The cabin smells of wet earth and old ash. You begin drying tools near the hearth. Months of heavy use have dulled blades and loosened handles. You sharpen your axe carefully, feeling the metal bite into stone. A sharp edge matters again, soon you will cut not just wood, but furrows. The well from Section 14 runs freely now. Water clear and cold, no ice to break. You almost miss the ritual of chipping. Almost. You walk to the field area beyond the clearing. The soil is too saturated for planting. But you test it with your fingers. It crumbles slightly instead of cracking. That is progress. Colonial farmers relied heavily on timing. Plant too early, and a late frost destroys seedlings. Plant too late, and the growing season shortens dangerously. Historians still argue whether weather unpredictability during the Little Ice Age caused more agricultural failure than previously thought. What's certain is that farmers watched the sky and soil with near-obsessive care. Back near the cabin, you spot the first true green shoots pushing through softened earth, wild onion. Perhaps. You kneel and harvest a few carefully. Their sharp scent feels almost luxurious after months of dried herbs. A lesser-known spring survival trick. Early greens like dandelion and wild garlic were often gathered to supplement diets before full harvests were possible. Bitterness signaled nutrition. Inside, you chop the fresh shoots finely and add them to a thin midday broth. The flavor transforms it. Not abundance, but renewal. The children splash in shallow puddles until you gently redirect them toward collecting fallen branches revealed by melting snow. Firewood gathering resumes, though less urgently now. You glance at the woodpile from Section 4. It survived the season. Smaller, yes, but not empty. You feel quiet pride in that arithmetic. The barn animals step more confidently onto exposed ground. The goats nibble at the first hints of emerging grass. The cow lifts her head higher than she has in weeks. You notice how your own shoulders feel lighter too. Not because work has ended, it has only shifted, but because survival has crossed a threshold. Winter did not starve you. It did not freeze your hearth into silence. It did not empty your barn. It tested you. And now the mud under your boots, inconvenient and messy, signals something simple and extraordinary. You made it through. You begin to count not what remains, but what was lost. Spring light grows stronger each morning. But it also reveals the quiet arithmetic winter performed while you were busy surviving it. You walk toward a neighboring cabin you haven't visited since the meeting house gathering in Section 17. The path, once a frozen corridor, is now a soft trail of damp earth. The door is closed. No smoke rises from the chimney. You knock gently. No answer. Colonial winters, even in established settlements, sometimes claimed lives, not always in dramatic storms, but in cumulative strain. illness that lingered too long, weakness from hunger, exposure during a single misjudged trip for firewood. Historians still debate how accurately colonial death records captured winter mortality causes. Many entries were brief: fever, cold, decline, but behind each word was a season like the one you just endured. You learn later, quietly, that the elderly woman who lived there did not survive late February. No blizzard, no wolves, just frailty meeting a long winter. You stand in your clearing afterward, feeling the weight of that knowledge. Survival is personal, but loss is communal. A lesser-known colonial reality, burial in winter could be nearly impossible when ground froze deeply. In some cases, graves were delayed until thaw allowed proper digging. The earth itself dictated farewell timing. Now, with soil softened, a small gathering assembles near the tree line. You join them. The ceremony is simple, words spoken softly, no grandeur, just acknowledgement that winter's toll was not zero. The children stand quietly beside you, sensing gravity even if they don't fully understand it. Historians still argue whether repeated harsh winters shaped colonial communities into tighter social units or simply hardened them emotionally. Shared hardship can either isolate or unite. You feel both emotions at once, relief and sorrow braided together. Back at your cabin, you glance at the beam where you carved winter's notches. Each mark represents endurance, but none record what others endured differently. You walk to the barn again. The animals graze lightly on new shoots. Life continues without ceremony. You check the repaired fence posts from Section 24. Reinforce a weak board. Small acts of maintenance feel almost sacred now. Inside, you air out heavy wool blankets from Section 5. Folding them carefully, you store them high and dry. Winter garments retreat, but not out of reach. Memory insists on preparedness. A lesser-known seasonal tradition in some communities. Spring cleaning was not merely symbolic, it removed soot, dampness, and accumulated residue from months of confinement. You scrub the hearthstones lightly, sweeping away ash built up since November. The cabin feels brighter without winter's heavy air. You reflect on how many colonial families faced similar reckonings each spring, counting livestock, tallying grain, remembering neighbors. Historians still debate whether long-term population growth in colonial settlements suggests winter hardship was manageable overall, or whether survivorship simply masked the quieter losses each year. You do not need numbers. You need gratitude and preparation. You kneel by the hearth one last time before extinguishing the midday fire completely. The warmth lingers faintly in the stone. Outside, birdsong grows louder, the forest shifts into movement. Winter has released its grip, but it has left its mark. And you carry that mark not as fear, but as memory. The fields call you now. Where snow once blanketed the clearing, dark soil stretches in uneven patches. Mud still clings to your boots, but the ground no longer resists every step. It yields, reluctantly, but willingly. You carry a small sack of seeds carefully, as if it contains something fragile and ancient. In truth, it does. Corn kernels saved from last harvest. Bean seeds dried and guarded all winter. Life stored in silence. Colonial survival did not end with winter's thaw. It pivoted immediately into planting. Timing mattered enormously. Historians still debate how much indigenous agricultural knowledge shaped early colonial planting methods beyond the well-known fish and maize technique taught to Plymouth settlers. But it's clear that adaptation to local soil and climate was essential. You kneel and press fingers into the soil. It is cool but workable. Not saturated, not frozen. You begin forming shallow mounds for corn, remembering lessons learned in earlier seasons. In some regions, fish were buried beneath maize seeds to fertilize soil, a technique observed among indigenous communities and adopted by settlers. A lesser-known detail: interplanting corn, beans, and squash, sometimes referred to as the Three Sisters, helped maximize yield and soil health. Beans fixed nitrogen, corn provided support for climbing vines. Squash spread low to suppress weeds. Ecological cooperation long before the term existed. You space the mounds carefully. Each one represents hope measured against memory. The children carry small baskets of seeds, dropping them gently into prepared holes. You cover them with soil and pat them down firmly, not too tightly. You remember February's thinning stew from section 23. That memory guides your spacing and care now. Historians still argue whether agricultural setbacks in early colonial years were due more to climate misjudgment or to unfamiliar soil conditions. Probably both. You mark rows with small sticks to track placement. Order matters when abundance returns, if it returns. By midday, the sun warms your shoulders noticeably. You pause, wiping mud from your hands. The forest hums softly now with insects returning. The silence of winter has fractured into sound. Inside the cabin, the hearth remains mostly quiet during daylight. You cook outdoors briefly over a small fire, savoring the scent of smoke mixing with open air rather than lingering in rafters. A lesser-known seasonal rhythm: spring planting often required entire families to work long days, compressing effort into narrow windows between frost threats. You feel urgency, but not panic. The goats graze farther from the barn now, nibbling at emerging grass. The cow lifts her head at the scent of fresh earth. Even the hens scratch more energetically in exposed patches. You walk the field again at dusk, surveying the small mounds like promises scattered across mud. Winter tested your endurance. Spring tests your foresight. Historians still debate how many colonial families truly thrived versus simply cycled through survival year after year. But each planting season carried possibility. You stand in the clearing as twilight settles. The cabin behind you looks smaller in spring light, less fortress, more home. The notches on the beam inside tell a story of what you endured. The seeds in the ground tell a story of what you expect. And for the first time in months, expectation outweighs fear. You wake to birdsong instead of wind. For a moment, you lie still, almost confused by the sound. After months of measuring mornings by frost on the door and the stiffness of your breath, the world now greets you with movement. You step outside barefoot for the first time since autumn, only briefly. Only to test it. The ground is cool, damp, but not punishing. You smile at your own caution. Winter has trained you well. The fields from section 28 show faint signs of promise. Small green shoots pierce the soil in scattered lines. Not every mound has sprouted yet, but enough have to steady your heart. Colonial farmers understood the fragility of this stage. Late frosts could still arrive, cruel and sudden. Entire early plantings could be lost in a single night. Historians still debate how frequently unexpected spring freezes devastated colonial crops during colder decades of the Little Ice Age. Weather records are incomplete, but the anxiety is well documented in journals and letters. You scan the sky often now, reading cloud patterns with new urgency. Survival has shifted from woodpile arithmetic to sky watching. Inside the cabin, you begin transitioning your space. Heavy winter wool blankets from Section 5 are folded neatly and stored. The heated bricks from Section 10 sit unused near the hearth. The hearth itself, once roaring daily, now burns only in the cool mornings and evenings. The stones feel almost grateful for rest. A lesser-known spring ritual. Many colonial households conducted thorough cleaning once winter ended, scrubbing soot from walls, airing bedding, clearing accumulated ash. You sweep the floorboards carefully, lifting straw and debris tracked in over months. Dust swirls briefly in sunlight streaming through the window. The cabin breathes again. You visit the barn. The goats graze eagerly, their coats shedding lightly in tufts. The cows' ribs no longer show as sharply. Even the hens produce eggs more regularly. Protein returns quietly to your table. You gather the first true fresh eggs of the season and hold them gently in your palm. Their warmth feels symbolic. You think back to the wolves of Section 21, to the thin stew of Section 23. To the dripping thaw of Section 24. Each stage layered itself into your memory like rings in a tree. Historians still argue whether colonists viewed winter as an enemy to be conquered or as a recurring teacher. From where you stand, it feels more like an instructor who never raises their voice, but always grades strictly. The children run through the clearing now without heavy cloaks. Their laughter no longer feels rebellious against silence, it feels natural. You kneel near the well from Section 14 and draw water easily. No ice, no chipping, just clear flow. In the evenings, you sit outside the cabin instead of beside the hearth. Fireflies begin appearing faintly at dusk. The forest hums with new life. A lesser-known colonial observation, spring often brought renewed trade and travel. As roads dried and rivers thawed fully, isolation receded with the snow. You glance once more at the carved notches on the cabin beam. They remain, silent proof of endurance. Winter did not erase you. It reshaped you. And as you watch the first corn shoots strengthen in soft earth, you realize something steady and profound. You are not merely someone who survived a brutal winter. You are someone who belongs to the cycle that follows it. You almost forget how long it felt. Standing now in the mild breath of late spring, it's difficult to recall the sharp edge of January wind against your face or the hollow worry of dwindling grain in February. The mind softens extremes once danger passes. But the cabin remembers. The clay chinking from Section 2 still holds between the logs. The hearthstones from Section 11 remain darkened from months of steady flame. The beam with carved notches from Section 10 bears silent witness to every week endured. You walk slowly around the clearing, noticing details you once ignored. Grass has thickened where snow once pressed heavily. The drainage trench you dug in Section 26 now lies dry and subtle. Proof that preparation outlasts panic. Colonial families measured success not by comfort, but by continuity. If livestock survived, if seeds sprouted, if children reached spring, Winter was considered endured. Historians still debate whether early colonial settlements romanticized their resilience in later retellings, smoothing over fear and hunger into narratives of triumph. But lived experience was likely more complicated, an uneasy mix of gratitude and exhaustion. You feel that mix now. The goats graze calmly. The cow swishes her tail at early insects. The hens scratch vigorously in sunlit soil. Life continues with quiet insistence. A lesser-known colonial pattern, many communities timed marriages and large gatherings for late spring and summer. Once survival through winter had been confirmed, celebration followed endurance. You sit on a rough-hewn stump near the field from Section 28. Watching the corn rise taller each day, the beans begin to climb. The squash vines spread low across the earth. The three sisters cooperate quietly beneath open sky. Winter once narrowed your world to hearth, barn, and well. Now it expands again, to field, forest, neighbor, sky. You think of the neighbor lost in Section 27. Of wolves heard in Section 21. Of frozen wells and chipping ice in Section 14. Of thin stew and careful rations. All of it feels both distant and near. Historians still argue whether colonial survival depended more on adaptation, community, or sheer endurance. From your vantage point, they cannot be separated. You adapted because you endured. You endured because you were not alone. You step inside the cabin one last time before dusk. The interior feels lighter without winter's constant fire. You run your hand along the hearthstones gently, almost in thanks. The heavy wool blankets are stored. The sled rests upright against the wall. The water barrel stands full without fear of freezing. You kneel where you once banked embers nightly and realize you have not needed to do so in days. The air carries warmth through the open doorway. Evening light pulls softly across the floorboards. You sit down slowly and allow your breath to lengthen. Winter was not a single storm. It was a series of quiet negotiations. Log by log, meal by meal, hour by hour. And you met each one. Now, as twilight settles and crickets begin their gentle rhythm beyond the clearing, you let your thoughts soften. The forest no longer feels watchful. It feels alive. The cabin no longer feels like a fortress. It feels like shelter chosen, not defended. You lean back against the log wall, listening to distant birds settling into branches. The season turned. You remained. And as night falls gently, not with the cold bite of January but with the calm warmth of earned rest, you allow your eyes to close slowly. Winter will come again, as it always does. But tonight, you are warm without struggle. Safe without calculation. At peace within the rhythm that carried you through. Let the fields grow. Let the animals rest. Let the hearth cool quietly. You have done enough. End of script. Sweet dreams.